Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Caldwell. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you again to another Hayek Lecture Series event. The Hayek Lecture Series is sponsored by three campus organizations: the Center for the History of Political Economy. I'm the director of that. The Duke UNC PPE program. Mike Munger directs that, and the Duke program in American Values and Institutions with Michael Gillespie. And welcome, Jeff.
Thank you.
Just saw you there. It's supported by a generous grant from the Thomas W. Smith Foundation. Our speaker today is Dr. Russ Roberts. Russ received his BA in economics from UNC, as a matter of fact, and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He's held faculty positions at the University of Rochester, Stanford University, Washington University, St. Louis, and George Mason University, and is currently the John and Jean Denault Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Russ is the, I'm sure many of you know, host of the award-winning podcast Econ Talk. I've gotten a little fatter since Christmas, but I would have been much fatter had I not been going with Russ to the gym, and he accompanies me at every workout, and I just haven't gone to enough of them. But these podcasts are wonderful things to do on rides, and for me, the few times I make it to the gym. He's also the co-creator of the Keynes Hayek rap videos, which I'm sure many of you have seen and heard. He's written a number of books, among them The Price of Everything, A Parable of Possibility and Prosperity, and The Invisible Heart, An Economic Romance. His most recent book is How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, An Unexpected Guide to Human Nature and Happiness. Copies of this will be available for purchase and signing after the talk. His topic today is The Real Invisible Hand, Hayek, Smith, and Emergent Order. Please join me in welcoming Russ Roberts.
So I have to tell you, the last time I was at Duke for a talk, as Bruce mentioned, I want to thank Bruce and all of you for having me and coming out. When I was last here, I was an undergraduate at UNC. This is probably 1974, 75. And Duke had a wonderful lecture series of eminent economists. And John Hicks spoke here. I don't know if I'd be interested how many people here know who John Hicks is. Raise your hand. So he had received the Nobel Prize a couple years before. He's a very renowned economist, famous for lots of things at the time. And a group of us decided we wanted to come over and see him. This is once in a lifetime opportunities, it turned out. And he gave a talk. His title was What Ricardo Really Meant. And I can't think of a drearier topic than what Ricardo really meant. But we came anyway, and he did not talk on that topic. He talked on something else. That was the good news. The bad news was that an illustrious member of the Duke Economics Department at the time fell asleep and snored loudly through the entire lecture. But slightly embarrassing. Anybody there? Anybody else there? Okay, it was special. But anyway, if you're not careful, you might think that my topic today is what Adam Smith really meant, because I'm going to talk about the invisible hand, and in doing so, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think Smith meant by the invisible hand. But that's not my main goal. My main goal, this is not I'm not a Smith scholar or a Hayek scholar. We have some here. I'm interested in what we can learn from Smith and Hayek and apply it to the real world. And along the way, we'll learn about the invisible hand, I hope. So I'm going to start with what has been called the Adam Smith problem. In the 19th century, some German scholars decided that there was an inconsistency in Adam Smith. So Adam Smith wrote two books. Give me one of them. Yeah, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his first book, which was published in 1759. And An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which was 1776. Very good year. And by the way, I'm going to call it The Wealth of Nations, even though I know there are people who are insulted when you shorten the title that way. But on his tombstone, as far as I can tell using Google Images, it says author of The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments. It does not give the full title. So, he wrote 2 books, and most of you know something, I assume, about The Wealth of Nations. It was trying to understand why nations grow, why some are wealthier than others. If you ask people on the street, what is Adam Smith famous for, they would say he's famous for The Invisible Hand, Free Trade is Good, The Wealth of Nations, etc. But he wrote this other book. And George Stigler, by the way, a great student of Smith, says that, somebody here will get the quote right, but the gist of it is that the theory of, The Wealth of Nations is an edifice built on self-interest. It's about the power of self-interest and how self-interest actually works. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a book almost nobody reads. I did not read it in graduate school. I didn't read it until a few years ago. The Theory of Moral Sentiments is a book about human psychology. It's a book about philosophy. It's a book about morality. It's a book about virtue. In particular, it's a book that tries to explain our benevolence. Why do we do anything that's nice for other people? So here you got this. William Smith is very proud of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. You have this one book, which is about why we're nice. And you got this other book, which is about how we're not particularly nice. We're self-interested. Not selfish, but self-interested. We're self-centered. So what's disturbing as a scholar is that there is no mention at all, as far as I know, in The Wealth of Nations about morality, virtue, benevolence, all the things he wrote about in this first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He revised it 5 times. There were 6 different editions during his lifetime, including 1789 or 1790, the last year of his life. So you can't say, well, he wrote the first one first, and then he decided people were more self-interested, so he ignored the virtue stuff. So it's a little bit weird that this guy wrote 2 books, only 2. He had some lecture notes we still have, but generally he wrote 2 great books, and they don't seem to have anything to do with each other. So what I want to do today, and the German scholars called this in their inimitable way, Das Adam Smith Problem, the Adam Smith Problem. So I'm going to give today, I'm going to give you 2 answers to the Adam Smith Problem. One is the one in my book, which is called How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, which I like, and it ties into Hayek. But I think the other answer, which I've been thinking about, is maybe even more interesting, and I'm going to give that one as well. And that's our roadmap for the talk. So the first thing to say is that the Adam Smith problem, and you're thinking, I thought he said he wasn't going to talk about what Adam Smith really meant. Don't worry, we're going to get away from what Adam Smith really meant. The Adam Smith problem is something of a straw man. Because even though the Theory of Moral Sentiments is about virtue and morality and benevolence, Smith talks about human beings as having a, quote, feeble spark of benevolence. He doesn't really talk about us as being gold-hearted, giving people. His explanation, by the way, for why we do good things, his explanation for our conscience, can be summed up in a single phrase. Quote from Adam Smith: "Man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely." Man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And by loved, he meant not just romantically loved. He meant admired, respected, people pay attention to you. And by lovely, he didn't mean just physically attractive, which he didn't mean at all. In 1759, by lovely, he meant honorable, virtuous, worthy of respect, worthy of honor, praiseworthy. So he said we are hardwired, man naturally desires, not only to be loved, he takes that as a given. We want people to pay attention to us. We want people to admire us, respect us. But we also want to be lovely. We want to earn that respect through good behavior, through being virtuous. That's the closest he comes to saying that we really are virtuous. But he's arguing that the motive for virtue, the motive for good deeds, is our desire to earn the respect of other people. And fundamentally what he's saying there is that our conscience doesn't come from religion, it doesn't come from our upbringing and our parents. It comes from looking at the world around us and seeing what people think is virtuous and admirable, etc., and adapting our own behavior to those standards. That's his explanation. By the way, as a side note, he says there's 2 paths to being loved. One is to be rich, powerful, or famous. And we know that that's still true. If you want people to pay attention to you, care about how you dress, look at the Academy Awards, right? Millions of people around the world watch that show and are riveted to those folks. Why? About that. And my example of this I use in my book is if Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie came to sit in the back of the room in the middle of this talk because they've always wanted to know about what the real invisible hand is, the lecture would just fall apart, right? No one would be looking at me. I'd forget what I was going to say. I'd be flustered. I'd be staring at them too. If you've ever been in the presence of truly famous people, they are disarming because we are so in awe. And Smith says, this is interesting, it's a different Adam Smith problem I'm not going to talk about, but it's so cool. He says, that's the wrong way. Don't be Donald Trump. Don't try to be famous. Don't try to have ambition because it's a fool's game. That's the wrong way to be loved. That's the glittering path that people stumble down. It's much better to be proper and virtuous. And by virtuous, he means mainly prudent, just, and beneficent. And he talks about what those mean, etc. But my point is that Smith, on the surface, it's true that his book is about why we do nice things for other people, his first book, but he didn't think it came from the fact that we're saints, okay? He thought it came from the fact that we wanted the approval of the people around us. My claim is that there's nothing inconsistent about these two visions of humanity. So let me explain why. In the theory of moral sentiments, he's writing about a different sphere of human activity. In the theory of moral sentiments, he's asking, how do I get along with the people around me? How do I get along with my family? How do I get along with my colleagues at work? How do I get along with the people I meet face to face? That is a very interesting set of questions, and that's the set of questions he answers in the theory of moral sentiments. And he says some remarkable things about it. It's a wonderful book. It's a fabulous book. It's a hard book to read, which is why I wrote my book, because it's written in 1759, and it's needed an editor. Okay, I'm sorry I said it. It's a little bit convoluted, and it's repetitive, but he has many, many deep insights into very common human problems. But that's what that book's about, face-to-face challenges of daily life, and why we're nice to people around us. The Wealth of Nations is about how do you make a living, how do you trade, how do nations thrive, and when you're in that world, dealing with strangers most of the time, in a world of modernity, right? In the modern world, thousands of people are involved in the stuff that I consume, and I know almost none of them. I don't know if they're nice, wicked, glorious, generous. I just buy the stuff. I get on Amazon and I buy it. And I buy it from the cheapest place I can find it, because when I'm on the web or I'm at the mall, it's okay to say what's in it for me, because that's natural. That's how human beings are. Smith is very skeptical of our ability to extend our fellow feeling beyond our intimate circles of family and friendship. And I think he's onto something. If you're interested, we can talk more about that later. But my point is that the simplest answer for me of the Adam Smith problem is that the Wealth of Nations is about trade and commercial activity, which is mainly with strangers. So I'm going to be pretty self-centered, reasonably so. Whereas the theory of moral sentiments is about how I interact with my close, intimate friends, family, etc. And I can't put myself first. I can't just be self-interested in that world, because if I am, I don't have any friends. Right? The whole essence of the theory of moral sentiments is that I have to curb my self-centeredness to interact with the people around me, almost by definition. So that's the standard, that's my answer. So I'm going to give you a different answer now, which I like even better. I should say first, though, since it's the Hayek lecture, that Hayek said something extremely similar in The Fatal Conceit. He said the following: part of our present difficulty, and by that he meant ideological and philosophical and economic, part of our present difficulty is that we must constantly adjust our lives, our thoughts, and our emotions in order to live simultaneously within the different kind of orders according to different rules. Meaning we have a different set of rules for how we treat our friends versus out in the economy at large, which is why when one of my kids tries to trade baseball cards with one of his younger brothers, and he has a great deal because he knows that this card's really valuable that his brother has, and he's going to give him almost nothing for it, I, the commissioner, intervene and veto the trade. I don't let my oldest son take advantage of his younger brothers. I don't let him act like a self-interested person because I want him to treat his brothers differently than he treats somebody at eBay because that's a better world. Walter Williams points out we're all kind of socialists in our families, right? I split the desserts equally. I don't say, oh, you had a better grade, you get a bigger piece of pie, right? I don't say, oh, the last leg of the chicken, let's auction it off. Prices are great. Right? I don't do that. I have command and control. I decide who gets the last leg. So Hayek says, if we were to apply the unmodified, uncurbed rules of the microcosmos, i.e. of the small band or troop, or of, say, our families, to the macrocosm, our wider civilization, as our instincts and sentimental yearnings often make us wish us to do, we would destroy it. Yet if we were always to apply the rules of the extended order, the macro, outside world, to our more intimate groupings, we would crush them. So what Hayek is saying is we have to be two different kinds of people. When we interact with our friends and family, we act one way. When we interact with our outside economic activity and commercial life, we have to act a different way. And that's what Smith, I would argue, is essentially saying in his two great books. So that's answer number one. So there's no Adam Smith problem because the two books are about two different things. But I'm now going to argue, I'm going to flip this around, and I'm going to argue that actually, even though they're two different books about two different things, they have something deep and profound in common. And I want to try to give you the flavor of that in the rest of the time. My flight's not till 9:10, so I have plenty of time. I say that because I think we could spend hours talking about this, and I'm going to try to keep it to 15, 20 minutes so we can have time for questions. Here's the question I would argue Smith is dealing with in both books. How do we get along? How do we manage to get along? Why is there harmony in the world? Now you might think that's a silly question because there isn't much harmony in the world. We don't get along so well. But I'm going to argue that we actually get along extraordinarily well. And we get along so well we don't even notice it, which is why you might think it's a strange question. So I'm going to start with the following. We shouldn't get along. There should not be harmony between us. Why? Because I'm self-centered. I want to hear myself talk, which is why I should be a professor, because you get control of the microphone for at least 45 minutes to an hour. That's a joke. You can laugh at that. The fact that they're not laughing, I think, is ominous for the faculty in the room. We like to talk. You know, the old joke, enough about me. Let's hear what you think about me. That's a little bit of all of us. Now, you might think to yourself, in fact, I told this to a friend of mine. He says, you know, he says, that's so true. He mentioned somebody we know in common. All he does when he calls me just talks and talks and talks. He never asks me anything. Then he gives another friend who does that. And I said, and I'm thinking to myself, I said, do you think anybody thinks that about you? Do you have your circle of people who you talk at, right? And I know a lot of people like that. Maybe I'm one of them, right? We all like to talk about ourselves. Imagine a group of us are going out after this talk, a group of faculty. This is what it should be like. Me. What a great talk. Wasn't it great? Wasn't it great? Them. Let me talk about my kids. And let me talk about my research. I don't want to talk about your talk. Is that okay? That's not what's going to happen. Or worse, it's a horrible talk. It turns out. And at the end, we go out and they say, well, that was a terrible talk. What am I going to say, right? That's not going to happen. Neither of those is going to happen. Why not? One of them might be true, right? Either it's a horrible talk or a great talk, but if it's a great talk, I'm not going to be bragging about how great it is. And if it's a horrible talk, they're not going to tell me. They're going to lie. They're going to say, hey, nice job. Why? Raise your hand. Why? Do you agree with me? Right? Why? Why is that going to not happen? That should happen. By the way, when I was younger, I hated dishonesty. We'd get in the car. A dad would take us out for ice cream. And when we get back in the car, everybody's eating their ice cream. Thank you, Mrs. So-and-so. Thank you, Mrs. So-and-so. Thank you, Mrs. So-and-so. You know what? I wouldn't say thank you. You know why? Because I thought, I'm just going to say it because they're saying it now. I'm going to say it later when it's more meaningful. Or sometimes I forget, right? But I hated those courtesies, or my favorite in America. How are you? It's not what it means. You're not supposed to answer that question, right? All how are you means is, I'm acknowledging that I see you and we're near each other. That's what how are you means. Because you say, fine, and you? Right? It's just a code word to describe that we're both alive and I'm acknowledging your presence. I had a Russian friend, true story. I'd say to him, how are you? He'd say, fine, like all Americans. Because in the Soviet Union, you don't say fine. You say, oh, it's horrible. You tell the truth. Right? In America, you're fine. You can have cancer, your kids can be arrested for drugs. How are you? Fine. Unless it's a friend that you know well enough, which is, of course, sometimes true, to tell them the real truth. And the question of that person isn't, I'm acknowledging your existence, it's, how are you? You don't look so good. Are you okay? How are you? How are you? How are you? How are you is not a real question. So we have all these conventions. So why is it that after this talk, I'm just totally degrading the quality of any praise or compliments I'm going to get, unless they're honest and they tell me it was awful. But why is it that after the talk, they're not going to say it's awful? Why is it after the talk, if it is good, I'm not going to brag about it? Why? Yeah.
Necessity?
Necessity? No, I think I can. By the way, I want to make it clear. How many people here have read the Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson? It's a fantastic book. I recommend it. People said to me, oh, you learn how horrible Steve Jobs is. It's true. He is not the nicest person in the world. But he was so talented that people were willing to put up with the fact that he would sometimes just say, oh, that was an awful talk. Right? Comment, what was her?
Society's an iterative experience.
Society's an iterative experience, and?
And if you want to succeed in society, you're going to have to please other people.
Well, it's good to please other people, but literally, if you ask me, how was the talk? Excuse me, let's ask one of the people I'm going out with, how did I do? And the answer is awful, which, by the way, sometimes people will ask you because they know it was awful. They'll say, that wasn't awful, was it? And what do they say? Oh, no, it was great. No, it was awful. Right? But they didn't ask you. They weren't asking you how was it. What are they asking? Could you please tell me, reassure me that it wasn't as bad as it felt? Right? That's what people do often. Not everybody. Steve Jobs would say it was awful. He'd say it was awful and it was great. Right? Everything was awful to Steve Jobs. But why is it? And the answer is because it's rude sometimes to tell the truth. Because we don't want always to know the truth. And if we went around telling the truth, boy, you look awful today. What happened to your hair? Oh, you put on some weight? Oh, your clothes look terrible. Your car's awfully beat up. Can't afford to fit. We don't say those things. Why? Because it's not nice, right? Is the simple answer. But why is it not nice? Why isn't honesty what is prized? And more importantly, where do the rules come from? Why are these the rules? So if you go, I flew out here today. You go to an airport. You see a bunch of people at an airport. What are they doing? Eating. Those are the three things. Looking at their phone, reading something, or eating. Nobody's talking to anybody. Almost nobody. There's sometimes families traveling. They're usually fighting, right? Trying to keep the kids from destroying something, each other, right? But everybody else is in their own little world. That's the way reality should be all the time. Given how much I like myself relative to you, I should be by myself. But you think about where the great moments of life come from. Think about the party after the basketball game. Or better yet, think about a beer commercial. What's a beer commercial? Is it a bunch of people sitting around by themselves? Oh, this is delicious. No, it's a big party. It's joyous. It's a bunch of people interacting. How do they manage that? Given that most of the time they just want to be, it needs to be about them. Because everybody's got that. So the answer is, why is the airport the exception? How do we manage to get along with each other? Why is it that the most satisfying moments of our lives are these not when I'm alone by myself, but when I'm interacting with other people, especially friends and family? There's a whole bunch of rules about how to behave. And I'm going to argue that ironically, the rules set us free. Without the rules, we're at the airport by myself. And Steve Jobs would have been by himself, but he came close to being by himself his whole life. You know, come to work barefoot. He washed his feet in the toilet. Oh, that's attractive. Can't wait to be around him. Why aren't we all like that? Doing our own thing. Why is it that we have these rules that allow us to interact with each other? Now, we make mistakes. We misread cues. We miss invitations for intimacy. We cross lines that we didn't notice. There are wrong notes that crop up when we improvise with strangers. But what's amazing is how much harmony we manage to create. And there's a set of unwritten rules of civility, politeness, interaction, empathy. Right? I can make a set of faces here. I'm going to make, watch, here's 4 faces. You tell me what they mean. Right? You know what every one of those faces means. Right? You've read the rule book. Right? The first face was I'm unhappy. Right? Something's wrong. You know what that is. You might not want to ask me. I understand that. Right? You see that person on the subway or on a bus or at the airport, you get away from. Right? That's a screaming person. Right? That scares you. But if it's a friend, oh, what's wrong? Are you okay? You know the rules. We've got the guidebook. Question is, where do the rules come from? And what Adam Smith was interested in the theory of moral sentiments was harmony. The way we match each other's expectations in dealing with each other. So I don't tell a stranger about my troubles. I don't tell a casual friend about my successes. I don't brag about my talk at the airport with the guy sitting next to me. I'm trying to say, hey, I gave a great talk tonight. Right? And I say, oh, I blew it. I gave a horrible talk. The guy was going to run away. That's against the rules. That's not allowed. Right? We know these rules. Now, not everybody understands them. Right? There's a big variation in how our ability, the nuance of them, they're very subtle. But my argument is they create social harmony. And it isn't just that we have a better time when we go out and have a party after a talk or after the basketball game or when we go out for a drink with our friends. It's a lot more important than that. It's civilization. It's the norms of proper, decent, polite, civil society that makes me think about other people and not just myself. That's a really big deal. Because it leads to lots of other things. Where do the rules come from? Here's Smith's answer. And he's going to use an unpleasant word in here called vicegerent. A vicegerent is a helper, an assistant. Think about it that way. It's my deputy. Think about, when I get to vicegerent, I'm going to read deputy. Smith argued that hardwired in us is this desire for approval and a desire to avoid disapproval, and that's what creates the rules. So here's what he says. The all-wise author of nature, meaning God, has in this manner taught man to respect the sentiments and judgments of his brethren, to be more or less pleased when they approve of his conduct, and to be more or less hurt when they disapprove of it. He has made man, if I may say so, the immediate judge of mankind. Meaning you say something cruel, you say something self-centered, you say something mean, I put a price on you. I impose a cost on you. My disapproval. I may say something. I may make a face at you. He says he makes man the immediate judge of mankind, and he has in this respect, as in many others, created him after his own image and appointed him his vicegerent, his deputy upon the earth, to superintend the behavior of his brethren. Meaning, these hardwired desires for approval and disapproval are how we motivate each other to be good. It's a very imperfect system, obviously. Smith's aware of that. He talks about the flaws in this system, the fact that we can easily fool ourselves into thinking we're lovely when we're not, the idea that when we have a big temptation to do something that's really fun, even though we know it's wrong, the voice of desire to be lovely, he calls it the impartial spectator. I don't listen so well at that point. But he says later on, I'm going to reflect on it, and I might have second thoughts, and I might have some shame. So, this isn't easy, learning the rules. We watch, we learn. I would call it growing up, is what I would call this. And some people, of course, never manage to learn. They struggle to read social cues. They struggle to sympathize with others. But fundamentally, what we're doing is we learn to make room for other people, even though our basic instinct is to put ourselves first. So this is very Hayekian. Hayek, in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, says that what judges should do, this is a crazy idea, what judges should do is not figure out what the legislation is and figure out what precedents there are, etc. What judges should do is figure out the expectations of the two parties and see if anybody violated those expectations. So you say to me, how are you? And I say, oh, let me tell you the troubles I've got. I've got trouble with the bank, got my car got wrecked the other day, my kids got in trouble at school, I'm getting a bad grade, blah, 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 blah. I violate the rules. I don't meet your expectations. You're a close friend. I haven't seen in a while. Maybe we'll talk more honestly about the situation, right? But that is, the expectations around us are subtle. They're involved with levels of intimacy. I call it rings of intimacy. As we move further and further out from our family, we get less and less intimate with the people around us. But we have these rules about how we behave, and when we match the expectations of the people around us and they match ours, life is harmonious. Life is good. So Hayek said what the judge should do is figure out what the expectations were, and if you break the expectations, you violate the law. You think about that. That's a deep, deep idea. Because a huge part of our civilization relies on the fact that there are unwritten laws. Right? So, example, my friend Don Woodrow likes to use, you go into the student union and there's a snack bar there and you put your backpack down on a table to hold it, and you come back and someone's put the backpack on the floor because you weren't there. It's against the rules. Right? In Chicago, if you shovel out a place for your car, you put a stick in the space where you shoveled, and you hold that place. There's no ownership. It's a public street. In theory, anybody can park it. You park there when someone else shoveled it out and marked it, they'll key your car. They'll scratch the side of your car. They'll vandalize it. There are laws that are not legislated. And Hayek's point is that by meeting the expectations of those around us, we allow people to interact smoothly when there could be conflict. Another example I like, you sell a house to somebody. It's a very unpleasant experience selling a house or buying a house. A lot of legal documents, but the more interesting thing is how few things are actually in the documents. The document should be 10 times longer with all the possible things that could go wrong. But there's a certain set of unwritten expectations when you buy or sell a house about what goes with the house and how you should leave the house when you sell it, how dirty it should be, how clean. And what Hayek is saying is that you have to meet those expectations. You have to figure out what they are. You don't always have to say them, but you have to figure out what they are. So I'm calling this harmony. So one of the questions that Smith is answering in the theory of moral sentiments is, where does social harmony come from? Where does the ability to get along come from? But he's answering the same question in the Wealth of Nations. It's the exact same question. Think about the analogy between the airport in our social interaction and our, what would be the commercial equivalent of the airport? Self-sufficiency. I don't interact with you commercially. I'm on my own. I'm an artisan. I'm a craftsman. I make the stuff that I need, and that's all I do. That's not modern life, right? Just like modern life for an urban dweller isn't, oh, I just talk to the people who are in my family. I talk to strangers. I interact. I smile. I laugh. I make friends. And similarly, what do I do commercially? I trade. I specialize. I exchange. And I create great things with other people. Just like I create a great evening, a harmonious evening with people after this talk, or I create a harmonious evening after the basketball game, unless you beat North Carolina, in which case you should be ashamed of yourselves or having a good time. But we create harmony. We create harmony with the people around us. Similarly, we create commercial harmony. And Smith's famous example of this is the woolen coat at the beginning of the Wealth of Nations, where it goes on for a page or more about how many people have to, I was going to read it, it's too long, but all the people that are involved in producing something simple like a coat. All the tools that were used by the people who created the coat. All the transportation that had to take place. And the people who were on those carriages and who were on those ships, etc. Thousands of people worked together to create a product in Smith's day. And of course that number is even much larger today with our products that are so much more complex. But Hayek, I think, understood it even better. And he makes a deeper version of commercial harmony, much deeper version in his article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, 1945, available online at the Library of Economics and Liberty without charge. I recommend it. If you haven't read it, you should read it. Have you read that article? Raise your hand. God bless you. It's a wonderful article. Vernon Smith, Nobel Prize winner, has said he's read it many times because there's so much depth to it. Ken, have you read it? How many times have you read it?
Many.
Yeah, so you can read it again. If you've already read it, read it again. Read it 5 times. There's a lot there. It's very deep. But what he's saying in there is the following. He's saying, the example he gives is tin. Can you think of a less romantic and inspiring example than tin? It's hard to. Hayek was not the most colorful writer. You can see that, Bruce. It's a tragedy, but it creates opportunities for the rest of us. It's a good thing. Comparative advantage, I guess. Anyway, he used the example of tin. He says, suppose a new use for tin comes along. And think about this. We never do. And the reason we never do is because we never have to. But that might turn out very badly. There's a new use for tin. That means either the people who are already using tin are going to lose their tin. Some people are going to come on and say, we think we've got a better use for it. We're going to take it. Which is the way the world worked before civilization, right? You bang your neighbor on the head, you take his stuff. That's how you get stuff in the old days. Not how you get stuff in a civilized society. In civilized society, somebody has a new use of tin. The current existing users of tin don't get their tin confiscated. It could be that the people who make tin are then put at gunpoint, say, you're not making enough, we need some, you go make some more. It's called slavery, a common way that people in the old days got more stuff. The potential for conflict when a new use of tin comes along is enormous, and we never notice it. And why? And that answer to that, of course, takes a good chunk of a good economics class, but it's very complicated. But the gist of it is that prices coordinate interaction between the different users so that there isn't conflict, there's harmony. I'll give you 2 of my favorite examples. Over the last few years, hundreds of millions of Chinese have gone from the countryside to the city. And many of them are sending their kids to school for the first time instead of working on the farm. And many of those kids, I assume, are using pencils. But how is it that you can go into Staples or any store in America and go buy pencils? They should say, pencils? Are you kidding? The Chinese got them all. Did you know that? Never happens. There's pencils. That's amazing. How about this? Super Bowl Sunday. Biggest pizza day of the year. Did you know that? It's also the biggest chicken wing day of the year, just FYI. You shouldn't be able to buy a bagel. How is it you can buy a bagel on Super Bowl Sunday? You can. You can get a croissant, you can get a scone, you can get whatever you want, muffin. They don't say, oh, are you kidding? All the flour. Do you know what Super Bowl Sunday? How is it that if a bunch of people, which has happened in America, suddenly decide they want to start exercising and changing their diet and having low-carb food, eating like paleos, right? It's a big trend. It's waiting for them. It's all there. You got a book. You want a book? I got 10 books. You want a cookbook? Training book? I got 20 books. I got special clothes for you. I got special shoes for you. Oh yeah, you're a paleo. I got the shoes with the toes. Yeah, you seen that? Those are great. How is it that you can have those, but other people who aren't into that at all, the couch potato, I get 10 flavors of potato chips. I get everything I want. Everybody gets everything they want. That's impossible. How is it that we all get along so well? How is it that it's harmonious? And what Hayek is saying, and implicitly what Smith is saying, is that there's a feedback loop system, which is prices and profits, that steers resources toward their highest use and different uses, and manages to do it without people fighting all the time. We should fight all the time. And as Hayek points out, if demand was stable, if there was no change, the world were a static place, this would be no big deal. You just figure it out, you just keep doing the same thing. The world's changing constantly, the paleo food thing, the exercise thing, the special device thing. It's like, oh, my dad doesn't have one of these, but he gets other things that he likes, right? There shouldn't be enough stuff to go around, but there always is. Not literally, of course we'd like more. Of course there's some people who are poor, but the fact that we don't fight all the time over our resources is an extraordinary thing. There's harmony. That, I would argue, is the real invisible hand. Adam Smith used the phrase invisible hand twice in his books. Once in The Wealth of Nations, once in The Theory of World Sentiments. He also used it in a lecture by Jupiter. Forget that one. But in both those books, The Theory of World Sentiments and in The Wealth of Nations, what Adam Smith meant by the invisible hand was sometimes good things happen when people don't have good motives. That's interesting. That's an important thing, but that's not what is great about the invisible hand. Something to do with it in some interpretations, but I would argue the real invisible hand, the important invisible hand, that's in our social dealings and in our economic and commercial dealings, that invisible hand is what Hayek called spontaneous order. And I don't like that phrase. I can't do anything about it, because that's the phrase that has emerged. Nobody's in charge of it. It's like nobody's in charge of the rules of politeness. We create them through our own interactions. No one's in charge of the prices. We create them through our supply and demand. The reason I don't like spontaneous orders, it sounds like spontaneous combustion. It's like, oh my gosh, whoa, spontaneous, whoa! I like emergent, meaning it comes about without anyone's explicit direction. But I do like the term spontaneous because it conveys our ability to be spontaneous. Our ability to decide, oh yeah, I don't want to eat carbohydrates anymore. I want low-carb bread. Can you make these? Oh yeah, we got that. We got that covered. I want special shoes with the toes. Yeah, we have those too. But does that mean no one else gets shoes? No, they get their shoes too. That is what I call the real invisible hand. The processes that underlie the order that emerges. The result is civilization. It includes the delight of friendship, and it also includes the division of labor that creates our standard of living. The complexity of the world around us masks an underlying harmony that allows human flourishing. Smith and Hayek both understood this, and I would argue that understanding how harmony emerges in the face of complexity is the real invisible hand. Thank you very much. Okay, so if you're going to be in New York City at the end of this month, March 22nd to 23rd, I'm going to be Adam Smith in an off-Broadway production called Money Lab, which I know you're all excited about. You're all going to make the trip up. But I'd hope to do an excerpt from that. I realize I can't. So you can keep taping if you want to tape the Q&A. And maybe that will be up on the web for those of you who want to see me embarrass myself, okay? But I'm losing my voice, so I can't do it. I'm sorry. Okay, any questions, answers, alternative speeches? Yeah.
Have you heard of Jane Jacobs by any chance?
I have.
Okay.
Yeah, have you?
Well, yeah, she has a wonderful book called Cities in the Wealth of Nations.
Yeah.
And, I mean, she has other books. She has other great books, too. But in there, she kind of takes, I guess, the idea of Adam Smith a little bit further and how these networks develop.
Well, what I like about her, that book's an interesting book. I read it a while ago. I don't remember it well, and I probably should go back and read it. But what I do remember of Jane Jacobs, which I think is wonderful, is the spontaneity of urban life generally, and that planned cities are not really very alive, and that cities work best when they're people are allowed to interact in ways that aren't pre-programmed, predetermined, etc. So she's very much a Hayekian or a Smithian in how she looks at urban planning, which makes her unusual, right? Yeah, that's a great point. She's a great, really interesting writer. Recommend it.
Apropos your Hayek excerpt from Fatal Conceit,
Yeah.
where the outside ethic into the family and vice versa, disaster.
Yeah.
What would Smith or Hayek say to the argument from, say, Public Choice, Rational Choice, or Gary Becker, that science is better off with a unified view of human motivation? Namely, we can't look at the political sphere as public interested, the market sphere as self-interested. That's the Public Choice view. And the Becker view that we should look at family relations as more self-interested, even though we don't want to. It doesn't seem right. It seems unseemly. And then lastly, I would just throw in, isn't there a lot of fighting in families? I mean, I agree with you. There isn't much fighting in the marketplace if there's the rule of law. There is a hell of a lot of fighting in families, and I'm wondering whether it's because we haven't extended. Anyways, that's an extreme case for self-interest across the board, but apropos Public Choice and Gary Becker, what would he say? That's the wrong approach?
Well, Gary Becker was my advisor.
So you know what I mean.
And I have a lot of respect for him, and I would argue I wish I had talked to him about this before he passed away. He passed away recently, and I started to realize, a little brief story. I saw a session in honor of Becker about maybe 10, 15 years ago, and somebody asked him who his biggest influences were as an economist. And those of you who know him, I think, would struggle to list these top. I think very few people, I'd say nobody is going to get the top two. They were Alfred Marshall and Adam Smith. And that's what he said. At the time, I thought, well, he's trying to give a grand answer. Didn't want to embarrass a living economist, maybe. I don't know. But I think to a large extent, his research agenda was to take the insights of Adam Smith and try to put them inside the rational economic framework. And he did that very well. He did that with great analytical power, and I learned a lot from him. And many people have it's made the world a more interesting place for that work. Having said that, I've become persuaded that I prefer Vernon Smith's insight. Vernon's my second favorite Smith. Vernon Smith says, I think this is what he said. I interviewed him about 2 months ago. He said our face-to-face Smithian interactions are not about maximization. They're about a code of conduct. And I think he's onto something there. The analogy I would use is dancing. Let's say I'm on a dance floor. It's crowded. And I'm a fabulous dancer. I'm 6 feet tall. Why not? It's a fantasy. So I'm a fabulous dancer, and I'm swirling my partner around the room. But it's a crowded dance floor. Now, think about the array of emotions that I have as I'm dancing on a crowded dance floor. There's a self-interested one, maybe. I want to be seen as a great dancer. I want people to go, wow, look what a great dancer he is. But I would argue that's not the main motive I have, and if it is, I'm not going to be a very good dancer. My main motive is to somehow mesh with my partner at one level and the other dancers at a fuller level. And one of the main goals is don't hurt anybody. Don't step on her foot, don't step on other people's feet, don't throw anybody off into the crowd accidentally. So I'm aware of a code of conduct. I'm not maximizing. Now, the maximizing model, the motif, is very powerful. There's a lot to be said for it. But I would argue it does not fully capture the human enterprise. I think Gary would admit that. Gary was trying to see how far it would go, and he took it as far as you could possibly take it. I've written a piece on this. If you want to see it, send me an email. Anybody, you're welcome to write me, russroberts@gmail.com, but any reaction or comments or questions. But I try to understand what are the limits to that maximum. We were talking earlier with some students about our evolution as economists, and being trained in Chicago, I was as Beckerian as could be, and I'm less so now, because I think there's a richer, I'll even go farther than that. I was also taught the Milton Friedman as-if hypothesis. That it's not, you don't have to get the model to be accurate, you just have to have it make good predictions. So people don't necessarily maximize their utility. It's okay as long as they act as if they maximize their utility. And I would argue that's true up to a point, but I think we've lost something in our understanding of the human enterprise as economists. And I think we've oversold the rational model to some extent. And I've become Smith was certainly very aware of our problems of self-deception, and I think they're very interesting. I'm not a behavioral economist. I think they make different kind of mistakes, but I think the understanding and accepting the fact that we're not pure rational maximizers is probably fruitful. Yeah?
Hi. So I really like the idea that there are these unwritten norms that enable us to have harmonious interactions, but what happens when interacting according to these norms leads to a net loss to society? I'm thinking of the case of like a prisoner's dilemma or a tragedy of the commons, where everyone acting according to expectations and according to these like economic norms leads to society being worse off. How would Smith or Hayek respond to that?
Well, I'll answer a different way. Let me answer how Eleanor Ostrom would answer that. Nobel laureate of 5 years ago. So what she was interested in is how norms emerge that avoid the tragedy of the commons. So let's take an example. I'm going to give you a comic example first, and then maybe a more important, realistic example. I have a relative, not going to mention what kind or what flavor, who would often, when we would come over for lunch when I was a little kid, would put out a very small amount of food. Okay? So there'd be 6 of us, and let's say there'd be 7 pieces of roast beef. Okay? But we need about 30 to make a decent sandwich for all 6 of us, okay? So there's 6 people, 7 slices of meat. Each of us would dutifully take 1 slice. I wanted 4. I was a growing boy. But we'd all take 1. And she would look at the 1 slice left and she'd say, see, I knew there'd be plenty. Because we had a norm, which was we all counted. We saw there were 7 pieces. Somebody could have taken 2 probably, but if somebody took 3, that's a violation. That's against the rules. And we all knew that. Similarly, if you're a fisher, a lobsterman, or a fisherman in a place where there's a chance that you'll overfish the commons, there are rules that emerge about restraining how much you take. Now, they don't work perfectly. My favorite example of this, I don't know if it's still true, but it used to be true. The Pacific herring, the fishing season for the Pacific herring lasts 18 minutes. A bell is rung. Everybody fishes for 18 minutes, and that's it for the year. Because without that bell and that rule, that law, they're going to destroy, they're all in one place, all the Pacific herring. And you can take them all, and then you'd have a problem. So sometimes emergent norms don't work, and it's good to have rules, and explicit rules, and have legislation. But a lot of times, which is what's to me more interesting, that it ever works, that you can avoid these problems. And the answer is sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. I would ask that there's something to be said. I was joking earlier about, I don't like empty compliments. I didn't like saying thank you when I didn't feel it. I wanted to wait and say my own thank you. I was 11. That's what happens when you're 11. You get older, you realize it's okay to say thank you even when you don't mean it. But you could argue that's a less interesting world. You're here in the South. You're here in North Carolina. I don't know if you've known. How many people are not from the South? Raise your hand. It's different here, have you noticed? People are polite when they don't mean it, right? And some people, that drives them nuts, right? I didn't like it so much when I was younger. I was born in Memphis. I'm a Southerner by birth. I went to school at North Carolina. As I've gotten older, I appreciate Southern politeness more. Anybody can call me honey anytime. I think it's just great. Right? Even when I know she doesn't think I'm a honey at the restaurant, right? And truthfully, I realize it's just fake, right? The person at the Gap, that cheerful person. Hey, how are you? It kind of cloys, it kind of gnaws at you, you kind of don't like it, but there's a part of it that it works anyway, right? So I think there's some deep, serious questions about phoniness, fake, politeness, etc. But most of what I'm trying to claim here today, I think is true. That it's just the grease and the oil, the lubrication that helps us interact with each other without hurting each other all the time. Yeah.
Given your first question, and given that the neoclassical model is really...
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Given your first question,
yeah.
You answered, given that the neoclassical model does not have perfect information, legal enforcement is costly, et cetera, would you argue that profit maximization as it's taught in any traditional neoclassical textbook, and this is Adam Smith's point of self-interest? Are they antithetical?
Why?
Well, I think there's something like price discrimination. You're simply trying to... There's no greater example of self-interest than marriage. And I will certainly try not to extract all the surplus from my wife if I can. It's a mutually advantageous relationship. Are we getting the same with markets if you're price discriminating and simply extracting the surplus from your conceivable trading partner?
Well, it's interesting. I write a reasonable amount of it in my book about marriage, because my argument is, coming back to the Gary Becker question related to yours, is that if you treat your marriage as what's in it for me, you're not going to have a very good marriage. It's always front and center. You can't help but wonder what's in it for me. But if you act that way, you don't have a good marriage. If you keep score, you don't have a good marriage or a good friendship. Oh yeah, he took me to the airport, my turn. We went where you wanted to go, now it's my turn. Right? That's not what friends do. Sometimes a friend needs something else. It's not, you should give them 2 turns in a row. Sometimes your wife might need, I don't know what, 15, 20 turns in a row? I don't know what you're, it depends. And God willing, she thinks the same about me, right? So I agree with that. I don't think marriage is accurately described as utility maximization for both parties. I do think we together produce something unique with a great marriage. So the rest of your question is, I don't think we exploit all the opportunities in a marriage. If we do, we usually get divorced or it's an abusive relationship. Out in the world, so what's the next part of the question?
I'll think of any type of a profit maximization situation for a firm. Minimize cost, maximize revenue.
Yeah, so my general bias, this is my Chicago side that's still healthy, is competition is pretty powerful. So I think the opportunities for price discrimination are limited. I understand they're still there. I will fly US Air again, even though I was on hold last night for 2 hours and 45 minutes after they canceled my flight, and I gave up at that point. You know, right? They will not pay the price that my grocer would pay if I waited for 2 hours and 45 minutes. Even my grocer might go back because it's the closest one. So they have certain advantages they can exploit. But I do think I prefer using competition to restrain that. The real interesting question for me is twofold. One is, should we be aiming for a gentler, less profit maximizing corporate culture, right? Or should we be teaching? I had a faculty colleague once, I'm not going to say who it was or where, who said, oh yeah, I always teach my students price discrimination because I know they're going to go off and work in business and that's useful for them. I'm thinking, so it's like saying, oh, if they're going to be slave owners, you teach them how the best way to torture their, why would you? So that's a confusion, I think, between what's rational and what's moral. Having said that, I think a lot of our business problems or cultural economic problems are from a lack of competition that's been imposed from the outside. Just take an example. I don't think Wall Street's very lovely, right? Selling mortgages to people who can't pay them back because you're going to still make money off them is really a nasty thing. So why did that happen? And there's a lot of different answers to that, but my personal answer, the one I'm attracted to because of my biases, let me lay it on the table, is that we destroyed the culture of loveliness that Wall Street once had when they spent their own money. And we gave them the opportunity to spend other people's money, which is what happened when we started bailing out creditors who had lent money to bad investments, which we started in 1984 and did again and again. We told Wall Street and the people who lent them money, if you lend them money and they invest it badly, you still get all your money back. So we helped destroy the natural feedback loops of loveliness that would have made, I think, Wall Street a little more civil. But it's a tough question. It's a good question. Yeah, in the back.
Does Hayek think that basically a society based on expectations or some of these norms and form are fine, you just leave them as entirely expectation based? Because it seems that on a whole it's almost always going to be harmful if they're not codified into some sort of law. Like, you key my car because I took your spot because there was differing expectations. I didn't know the expectations, or I knew the expectations and didn't care. It seems like that could escalate or create a lot of harm. The same way if you took the 3 slices of meat, by not making some sort of rule or by not putting something concrete, it seems like there's just very likely more bad things to occur.
Well, if you put your lobster traps in the territory of the people who are not, if you put your lobster traps in other people's territory, they steal them. And that's the rule. They key your car and it's okay. And you learn. So I don't want to argue that, I'm never going to argue that it works perfectly. There are people who violate the norms all the time and they get an advantage sometimes from doing so. And I would just, as personal advice, say, be lovely. It beats the alternative, right? You're in a group project and there's some jerk who doesn't carry their weight, right? Happens all the time. You want to complain, you want to tell the teacher, that person doesn't deserve the same group. Live with it. Not worth it. Be lovely. Be a sucker sometimes. It's a lot better than being, than always looking out and trying to get an edge over. And the person who's the person who's free riding, they're a jerk. They gotta live with that. They probably don't know they're a jerk. They might think they're clever, right? That's even sadder. So you feel sorry for them. That they're proud of the fact that they got an A on your project that you did most of the work for, right? But I'm gonna come back to the question. If you said it a different way, you said.
Well, just using what you just said there. I mean,
oh, I know what I want to say.
If a lobster fisherman steals another person's traps, they're probably someone guilty of theft. And if someone keys your car, under the society, you know, the
Yeah.
structured society.
There are many things that work better when they're organized, literally from the top down rather than emergent from the bottom up. Again, I don't want to say that everything can be solved by these emergent phenomena. They're not. Some emergent orders are awful. If you live in a racist society, it's great to be racist. In fact, if you stand up for minorities, people hate you. And that restrains the ability of people to speak out for what's good. So I don't want to suggest these things all are perfect. I've overemphasized the harmonious, pleasant part of it, but there are harmonious orders that have ugliness to them. So I don't want to oversell their virtues. Yeah.
So just a quick observation in the the first part of your answer to that question, you almost seem to brush off the free riding problem or say, well, it's okay to ignore free riders sometimes. Now, I take it that the Hayekian solution, the Ostrom solution of relying on social norms as emergent orders that solve collective action problems only works to the extent that we're each willing to take on personal costs to police rule infractions.
Up to a point, and I would argue that I'm going to answer the second part, but I'll try to remember to come back to the first part, and if I don't, you'll remind me. The second part's fascinating to me. I argued in my book that we live in a very tolerant time, which I think we do in many ways. We're very hesitant to be judgmental of other people, to tell them we don't approve. So in that sense, I would argue that these feedback loops of approval and disapproval have been weakened. At the same time, there's an incredible article, if you haven't seen it, probably lived it, incredible article in the New York Times Magazine a few weeks ago about, somebody posts something she thought was funny before she got on a trip to Africa, and she tweeted it. And she gets off the plane in Africa and her phone's like on fire. People are calling her, are you okay? What's wrong? What happened to you? Blah, blah, blah. I hope it's all right. And she's thinking, oh my God, what happened? What happened was her tweet went viral. Everybody hated it. Instead of just saying, oh, just a casual comment, somebody was in a hurry, they thought it was fine there, and it's not. They savaged her and, in some dimension, ruined her life. I mean, the willingness of anonymous people to be judgmental about other people has never been higher. And the mechanisms for doing it have never been more easy. So we live in a weird time, I think, where people are incredibly tolerant of people's flaws, which is in some ways a beautiful thing. Smith would argue there's a cost to it, but at the same time, we live in a time when people are very, very unforgiving. I'll take just one example. Tiger Woods, right? Horrible thing to cheat on your wife. He paid a pretty good price for it. Ruined his career forever, it looks like. Never win another major tournament again. That'll keep you thinking twice about adultery, maybe. So that's, you could argue, is that a good thing? Is the price too big? It seems a little large, right? So we live, and plus, everybody knows about it. You make a mistake, if people find it amusing, it's not just your mistake, or it's in your family, or your town, or your work, it's everybody knows, right? So we're living in a very interesting time in that dimension. But I want to come back to your first part. What was the first thing you said? Oh, the Austrian solution. So I don't want to oversell this. I deliberately talked about harmony because I don't want to oversell it as, quote, a solution. I don't want to minimize the free rider problem. I don't want to argue. To me, that example, the big difference between free riding in a class project and free riding in other dimensions. I think it's really great to give to charity. I encourage everybody to do so. I understand everybody will, because there's a temptation to say, I'll let other people pay for it. That happens all the time. The question is, what should we do about that that's effective? There's a lot of things you do about that aren't effective, right? Challenge is, what do you do that's effective? So my main goal today, though, isn't to say, oh, we have all the solutions. Just have to leave things alone. It all works out great. That's stupid. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it's amazing how many things work out pretty well that don't have top-down control. But that doesn't mean that there's no role for government. It doesn't mean we should be anarchists. I'm interested in those ideas, but I don't think they're open and shut. Yeah.
This will be the last one, I guess.
Last question.
Yeah. Well, one comment about Twitter, which is a catalyst for mobocracy, obviously, but that's another issue.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you'd read an article by Peter Singer in the New York Times about charity, about philanthropy. And his argument seems to me to absolutely discount the distinction between the private realm, where you know people and intimate things and so on, and the public. Because basically what he was saying is you shouldn't give money to an art museum, you should give it to suffering kids in Africa. In other words, he wants to rank all the suffering in the world and the most suffering gets the most money. And that would, of course, totally separate your concern for your family and your friends. It would say that's discounted. Do you have any thought about that?
Yeah, I did not read that article, but I did. I interviewed Joshua Green, who's a Harvard psychologist and a big utilitarian who grapples with these issues. They're very interesting. I find them extremely interesting. I would just make a couple of points. One, I don't think everybody's ranking is the same, and therefore I don't think we should have one. There isn't one absolute ranking. The other point I make is the Hayekian point, which is knowledge is dispersed, and how much neediness there actually is and what people actually would make their lives better is not obvious and is complicated. And when you use a top-down solution, you have a one-size-fits-all, and I think that's been a very bad thing. So I'm a big fan of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, even if you don't get quite as much, you won't raise nearly as much money through private charity. I'll give you another example. It would be my preference for the US government at the state, federal, and local level to get out of the education business. I think they do a horrible job, and they've done a terrible disservice to the poorest people among us. They do a pretty good job on rich people, by the way. If you live in a rich neighborhood, you get a pretty decent public school. If you live in a poor neighborhood, you get a horrible school. That's a bad system to me. We do the same thing with police, by the way. If you live in a rich neighborhood, you get great police protection. If you live in a poor neighborhood, you get horrible police protection. Now, my view, what I would advocate for is get the government out of it and let private schools emerge that would serve their customers. And they'd have customers, people who they actually had to make happy if they wanted to keep the money flowing in. But that would be horrible for poor people. Yeah, like the current system isn't. The current system is also horrible for poor people. The question is, which would be better? Would poor people get to go to school? Yes, there'd be people would give charity. They do it now. It's an unbelievable thing. People give millions of dollars so that poor people don't have to go to public schools and have scholarships to go to private schools in K through 12 education. That's in a world where there's a free alternative, an alternative without charge called the public school. Even in that world, people will give. So get rid of the public schools, people will give more. How much more? I don't know. Will it be better than the current system? I don't know. I'd like to try something different. Right now, there's a guy in New York City, Jeffrey Canada, who runs a cradle through college set of social services using mostly private, not entirely, mostly private money. He started a school, he started a daycare center, he has education for parents, and he said, I'm not going to fix one thing. I'm going to fix everything. Okay? It's really cool. So I interviewed a guy, Paul Tuff, who wrote a book about this, and who writes about him in a second book. He said, all we need, it's terrible that Jeffrey Canada, who's a brilliant man, who has this wonderful entrepreneur to help people in this, it started off as a square block in Harlem, and now it's a big set of blocks, and he's changing people's lives every day. And we should give him money. And I want to give him money. You should give him money. And Paul Tuff said, yeah, but he wastes too much time fundraising. We should just give him money through the tax system. And I said, how are the current programs working that we run through the tax system? Oh, they're horrible, he said. So why would this? We'll have to do it better, that's all. And my view is the incentives built in to the private system to help less fortunate people would work better than the way the current system works. Because I don't think the current system helps less fortunate people very well. I might be wrong. I might be wrong, but I think it's time to take a chance that I might be right. That's my take on it. But my point is that Jeffrey Canada cares a lot about the people in his area. And I agree that it'd be great to have 100 of them. But we're not going to have 100 if we just give 100 people the same amount of money that he raises through his fundraising efforts, where he has to please his donors, show his progress, etc. And I think that matters. Thank you, folks.
Okay, thank you.